Welcome everybody to another episode of What Works, how to handle life's biggest challenges and questions. So this is a series of conversation where we meet people with from different disciplines and experiences of trying to find answers. So this time we have the great pleasure of having an expert on the topic, I think. I don't know if he thinks he is, but a lot of us think he is. So Scott Miller is here. I'm just going to say a few words because Scott has a lot more knowledge about who he is than I am, but some kind of labels like licensed psychotherapist, psychologist, researcher, founder of the Clinical Center for International Excellence. No, wait, I turned it around. It's better to let you explain who you are. So I give the word to you, Scott. Who are you?
I am a psychologist, and I've been in the field for about 35 years now. And I founded and now direct the International Center for Clinical Excellence.
Yeah.
If you just type in those phrases, International Center for Clinical Excellence, our website will come up. It's a very large group of mostly mental health, substance abuse treatment professionals who are dedicated to really pushing their performance to the next level so that they can help more people. That's what it's all about.
That's what it's all about. So I've been thinking a lot how to start this because I really went down the Scott Miller rabbit hole and researched and looked at videos, listened to podcasts.
Wow.
It feels like we've been talking for a while now, but this is the first time we actually met. Even though
right.
I've listened to you because you're in Sweden sometimes. So I've listened to you and read things about you, but trying to figure out what questions, because I know I will set you off and you will go. So
I'm flattered that you take the time to do that. That's
yeah. It's obviously because something had made an impact when I've listened to you before, and much about client feedback has been a way of me changing my approach in my work. So it seems useful to listen to you in the reality of my everyday work also. But I narrow it down to basically one starting point for this conversation. So let me frame the question and then I will let you jam along with it. So a lot of us people that work in so-called mental health or therapy field listen to all kind of experts telling us what works and what doesn't. And for a long time, many of my colleagues and myself have you as one of those guys you want to go to when you want to find out. We're talking about more the scientific side of what we're doing, research, data, and stuff like that. So this is the picture I've been curious about, because you know a lot about that. There's also a lot of the stuff you have done in articles and on YouTube. So I kind of decided to go with a question that goes more into where you are now in your journey in finding out what works. So to start that, I want to find an interesting point that I found when I researched what you're doing now. And that point is kind of like a crossroad. So let me frame it, and I'm curious to know how you ended up in that crossroad and where you went from it. And the crossroad is, the scenery is like this. I think you're sitting in a room and you have some kind of psychic in front of you, a mentalist maybe he's called, and he's asking you, do you believe in the paranormal? And you said no. And he took out a bunch of tarot cards. So what happened that led you into that room? From this curiosity about what works in therapy, you're in that room, and what happened after that? That's kind of where I'm interested in starting off. Is that okay for you?
Yeah, absolutely. My interest in...
Oh, sorry, I just want to check that everything's technical. Okay.
Okay.
Go ahead.
My interest in tarot card readers, or what have been called mediums, those who claim to speak to people who've died, and then mentalists who are actually professional performers and who give you the sense that they can read your mind. You might be more likely to see them at a club or a show rather than consult them for advice. We ended up speaking with them because we were trying to understand how it was that certain mental health professionals achieved outcomes that were consistently better than everyone else's. This is kind of the big secret in the field of mental health that no one is willing to talk about, and I think we've actively ignored since it was first reported scientifically in 1974. So 37 years ago, a psychologist by the name of David F. Ricks does a study that shows that who does the treatment is more important than what treatment they do. It's a very staggering finding, but he had no idea, and he says as much in his article from 1974 about how the therapists were more effective than others. And by the way, this is something we all know, but when we're making referrals, if we're thinking of going to therapy ourselves or sending a family member or loved one, we don't just say, let's roll the dice and just take anybody. We don't spin the wheel and say, oh, it's that person. Instead, we're very careful in our selection. Why? If all therapists are equal, what difference does it make? We know they're not equal. But
that's the secret you're talking about. The dirty little.
That is the secret. The secret is we are not all equal. Some are more effective than others. Our field, in the meantime, has spent its entire history since about the late 1950s studying methods. The idea has been the method will make you helpful. That idea has been researched over and over again, and despite what therapists believe and what they hear at workshops, there isn't any evidence that the model contributes much to the outcome. There just isn't evidence of that. That does not mean we don't need to have ideas, but for our team, we were really interested in how it was that certain therapists were more effective, because the assumption was maybe we could learn something from them. The best tend to influence the performance of others if we can see that performance. That happens in music.
Yeah.
That happens in sports. Somebody does an amazing performance and everybody's trying to replicate it. That doesn't happen in our world. Instead, we all rehearse the exact same thing and expect the same results.
So just to be a bit a friend of the majority of us who might believe that our methods are the thing that's creative force in what we do. So have you found anything that makes sense, that this kind of secret still has a life, that it's not talked about?
Yes, of course. It's because primarily what researchers might call the organizing paradigm. So you and I were all embedded in a way of thinking. That thinking influences the questions we ask. And the way we tend to think since about the late 1800s, early 1900s, is we think in a deeply materialistic, medicalized view. Now let me
more what that is.
And let's just think about the medicalized view. First off, only something you can see matters. It's materialistic. There isn't anything beyond what we can see and touch and palpate. We believe mental processes are all linked to some action in the brain or the biology. The medical view is that your treatment has to contain something that is active, that solves the problem. So in a pill, it has to contain something that kills the bacteria responsible for the disorder. And we have the same idea about psychotherapy. Let me give you an example. People believe that depression, for example, is caused by dysfunctional thinking.
Mm.
So what do we have? Cognitive therapy, which is designed to change our thinking.
Mm.
And then if it works, we say, see? The problem is that when studies look carefully at this, they find no evidence that cognitive therapy heals because of that.
No.
Instead, there are a group of other factors that seem to work across treatment approaches that are responsible for the change.
So we'll come to that in a second, but the it's kind of like the earth is flat and we all go around pretending like it is because we don't know better. And we all think that the emperor has nice clothes. And here you are telling us, well, the emperor is naked. It's kind of a naked feeling to be, if you haven't invested a lot of in your identity as a therapist or maybe a psychodynamic therapist, and you here you come and say, well, that doesn't really do it. That's not the thing that's important.
The issue really is how therapists try to improve, because if what the medical model would say that if you're not being helpful, that you need to reach for the next new ingredient, or that it's something wrong with your diagnosis, or that the client is unwilling. These are sort of the traditional ideas that account for why it doesn't work. And all of those are medical points of view. We know how to treat an infection. You take this pill. If it doesn't work, well, wrong problem, or the client was non-compliant. I mean, those are the only possible explanations.
So it seems.
So the question is, what's the alternate? We are so involved and wedded to this paradigm that it's hard for anybody to think, well, what would you believe instead? But there is an alternate paradigm that emphasizes something different than the method, the diagnosis, etc. And that would be a contextual paradigm.
Okay.
In a contextual paradigm, the participants matter and the setting in which the process takes place matters. So this allows us to say that there's something important about that particular therapist that causes change to happen in more easily, more quickly, more effectively. If you're in the medical paradigm, when we see differences between providers, we consider that noise. The whole point of the medical paradigm is to eliminate the difference between the providers. In the contextual paradigm, the provider is an important ingredient in the treatment. So for the study of top performing therapists, the therapist comes into focus. And by the way, the research indicates that who does the therapy is between 5 and 10 times more important than what method they use. Now, at the same time, the method is also important, but for a very different reason. Instead of delivering the help through their methods, the methods simply become a way to structure the conversation, to inspire engagement of the participants, and to give direction. So when I speak, very often people say, oh, Scott Miller, he doesn't believe that any methods matter. I say they matter for a different reason. And so if you're always looking for the method that will make you helpful, I promise you that outcome will always elude you.
But you'll go to a lot of conferences and educations and learn new methods in this constant search for the one.
And what have we got as a result of that? Our own research and now other researchers have looked at the outcomes of psychological care over the last 40 years. No improvement. What else do we find? Individual therapist outcomes do not improve over the course of their careers. They do not, on average, improve.
So let's slow down just a little bit, Scott, because I think this is fascinating. So for anyone's listening, you are actually saying that when you start out as a therapist and you move through time and experience and meet a lot and more people, and and at the end of your career, there might have been no change as
Yes.
your outcomes. You're not a
And
better therapist.
no, if we define a better therapist as somebody who helps more people, then the answer to that question looks to be no. And not only that, there's evidence that therapists actually get worse
Yeah.
with time and experience. And now I'm a research scientist and a clinician. So that's interesting to me. And instead of denying it and developing a new method, what we should be doing is asking, what differences do we need to make in our thinking
Mm.
about this activity we do that would help us overcome that barrier?
So that's a lot to take in, but it's also it creates some kind of mix of resistance and curiosity dancing together.
Mm,
So
mm.
so in what way is this related to you ending up in a room with a tarot reading
So,
people?
yeah,
It's
it's a great question. 1974, David Ricks does this study and says, here are these top performers. Not a single study was done on that subject for 30 years. Nobody says, well, what is it about those people? Nobody. Instead, we relentlessly pursue the method that will make us helpful. 2003, Okishi and Lambert use data from routinely administered outcome measures to, I can't even remember how many clients there were, hundreds and hundreds of clients in their study. They came up with the same finding. Certain therapists were reliably more effective. How much more effective? Their clients changed 10 times faster than average therapists. Now, if I told you that you could improve your client's response rate tenfold, wouldn't that be of interest to you? Instead of going to the next workshop about touching or tapping or finger waving or this magic spell that we cast. Here's how they end the article. They say, the results are astonishing, but, and this is almost a verbatim quote, how they do it remains a mystery.
Yeah. So one of your articles that really caught me was, I think it's called Losing Faith. Because probably, I don't know, but maybe some of the listeners are starting to lose faith in their career choice, being therapists. This sounds like there's some kind of wisdom in it, but the sense of, so what am I supposed to do? It starts to show up, because in the article you will referring to your own experience of kind of losing your breath in this kind of work. And so it's a topic that really kind of shakes you around. So with that basic understanding, if we were to go to the curiosity about this, how can we make sense of this instead of going into new methods and getting more branches of different kinds of therapy models? So what you lost your faith, if I understood it correctly, and doesn't sound like you're out of faith when you're talking now. So
no.
So help us through what if we want to move in that unknown territory where we're not looking at models. What have you and your team been doing, and what did you do to get to a next step?
It really requires placing our faith in something other than what we have been doing. It requires the very question that you're asking, which is what do we focus on instead? But if you cannot get outside of that, if you cannot ask yourself that question, then there's really no reason to listen to anything more that I say. And I understand the crisis that it can cause, because as you point out, I experienced that myself. For me, however, I viewed that crisis as an opportunity to ask the question, how could I learn from these top performing therapists?
Okay.
Not because I was going to be the best therapist, but because maybe they knew something that the rest of us didn't know.
Mm.
So how does this lead then to sitting in a room with people with tarot cards? And the answer is that in addition to focusing on methods, whenever our field has studied top performers, they have never actually looked at what they do until very recently. Instead, in fact, they haven't even based the identification of top performers on outcome data. I mean, I don't really care if everybody thinks someone is great. I want the proof. And when I see a provider, a helper, I don't care that everybody else thinks they're great. I want to know, are they helping me? So you have to measure outcomes. That's the first start. And we began measuring outcomes. We found again that certain therapists were better. And it took my accidental encounter with a Swedish psychologist named Anders Ericsson to begin to unfold how it was that these top performers achieved what they did.
Yeah.
And that particular psychologist, who'd been studying other fields of top performers, chess players, musicians, sports, said that top performers tend to spend more time reaching for performance objectives just beyond their current ability. And he called this deliberate practice.
Okay.
So that meant I had to measure my outcomes and see how good did I do. And then I had to find my weaknesses. I had to find where my outcomes fell short, who I didn't help, who dropped out of my service. And then I had to work hard at reaching further to improve my performance. And we found that those top performers spent about 2.5 times more hours per week than average therapists engaged in deliberate practice, in reaching for performance objectives that were just beyond what they could do at the present time.
Could you give an example? Those 2.5 hours, what does that practically mean? What are you doing besides actually therapy?
So I love that you asked this question, because whenever I talk about this, that's the exact question that therapists ask me.
Yeah.
What should I do? What should I do?
Yeah.
Just tell me what to do and I'll do it. And that's part of the problem.
Probably.
It is part of the problem because therapists, they want to know what to do to help their clients. That's why most of them get into the field. But it also makes them susceptible to people who have something to sell. Here, I'll teach you this. Try this new trauma technique. Try this new cognitive technique. Last year's techniques are out of date, so try this one. Practice this. So in order to use deliberate practice, here are the steps. You first have to measure your results. This isn't something you can do in your head. Why? Here's an interesting piece. In our study, we found that the least effective therapist in our sample rated themselves as effective as the most effective providers.
Yeah.
So if you're not effective, you're not going to typically know it.
No.
Or admit it to anybody. So the first thing you have to do is you have to measure. Yeah. Then you have to identify the specific instance where your outcomes fall short. Now, here's the curious part. Maybe where your outcomes fall short is in how you structure the session. Because we do know that having a structure and a focus and strategies helps make therapy effective. It doesn't matter which one, CBT, IPT, EMDR, it doesn't matter. But it does matter that whatever structure you adopt creates expectation and hope on the part of the client and gives them direction. If it doesn't do that, that may be an area where you need to focus.
Yeah. So there's not one answer. There's an answer depending on who you are.
And if the therapist is important, doesn't that make sense?
Yes, it seems really obvious. If you go into sports or some other kind of field, it feels like the basics of what they do. They keep on training, finding the muscle that needs more power and whatever it is.
I mean, and the shift. Now, see, now you're making my hair stand up on my neck, because that's the exciting shift.
Mm.
You start to see the possibilities, Johnny, that, oh my gosh, I can find out and I can improve from where I'm at and what I need to improve. At some point, in fact, think about this. If you already do pretty well, going to a workshop and learning a new technique may actually make you worse.
Mm.
So if you're the championship, say, tennis player, and you decide, if you're a championship tennis player, but you decide, I'm going to change my backhand because I saw this guy teach this workshop over here, it probably won't make you better.
No. So this, in some way, changing this way of looking is kind of making a plot twist, and all of a sudden you're connected to. So what's my weak spots? What do I do? What do I need to develop? Instead of just developing the same thing all over with different methods. So this doesn't seem to answer the question of how you ended up in a room with a tarot reader.
So our field was when the subject was, what is it these top performers do? Our field didn't offer much help. Mostly what it offered was very formulaic or very general suggestions. So it would say, to be a good therapist, you have to like people. Is this what separates the best from the rest of us, that somehow they like people more? I mean, it's silly. It's silly. It's like saying, well, what's the difference between a championship soccer player and an average one? Well, they kick better. Well, does that help you? I mean, it doesn't help you at all. So we started to look for areas outside of our field where expertise was better understood. And one of those areas that had very specific ideas was in the field of mentalism. Now, you'll recall from the beginning of our conversation that mentalism is more a field of entertainment. You go, it's enjoyable, and people the performer seems to be able to read your mind. Or the tarot card reader, if it's a tarot card reader, seems to know things about you that, how would they know that if you've only met for 3 or 4 minutes? So we began to interview top performing mentalists, tarot card readers, and mediums to see what we might learn from them. And curiously, we also did a study where we began surveying people who'd either seen a therapist or who'd gone to a tarot card reader or a mentalist. And that study just came out about 4 weeks ago in the Journal of Mental Health Policy and Administration. Curiously, here's what we found. People who'd visited a psychic reported getting more help than people who'd seen a therapist.
Wow.
And if you ask, well, what was it? There were 2 things they seemed to do. The first thing is they formed better and stronger relationships. So we know about relationships in our field. We believe it's central, but we keep saying shit like, yeah, but everybody has to have a good relationship, but you need this technique. Well, maybe you would do well to enhance your relational abilities, your ability to respond empathically. And this seems to be in part what explained the difference. Tarot card readers, mediums, and psychics tended to align themselves with the client's goals better than therapists.
Wow.
They tended to give explanations that fit with the client's ideas and theories of how the world works. which enhanced their engagement and expectation of improvement.
Hmm.
And the third thing they did was they gave more direction.
Yeah. So you stop for a second there. I'm not quite sure you're talking about therapy or mediums here.
Yeah.
You
Well,
engage.
wait. That's the point.
Yeah. In a relationship, you engage.
Yes.
You create interest. You are in some way giving explanations, plausible explanation for the suffering, I guess. And you also, this is kind of where it shifts a bit, give advice.
Yeah, direction.
So that's kind of like a little bit off limits in some therapies, I think, but this, it seems very similar. So and you say, well, that's the point.
Yeah.
So
so the point here is that stop being interested in therapy and start being interested in helping. If you think through this narrow lens of therapy, then suddenly it's about your childhood, your dysfunctional thoughts, your emotions, or your brain chemistry. If you start thinking about helping, then it's whatever culturally and personally makes sense, engages that person, and helps them move on. And do you think we invented that? I mean, the hubris of that, the hubris of believing that somehow we figured it all out. And now we're exporting it to every place else. When in fact, almost all cultures have enshrined certain people as uniquely capable of helping others.
So this is really interesting, because that also puts therapy, not only the therapist, but the activity of therapy within its culture context, really interesting, because I could see myself going off to some other culture and trying to do therapy where they're expecting a shaman to show up.
Yeah.
I would probably be not so interested for that culture, but there's something about the view of therapy in our culture that seems to be less interesting to the medium, the community of medium and people who believe that that will help them. So that, but that happens in a materialistic culture. So it's kind of interesting. How do you make sense of that?
Well, something that happened along the way, and just so you know, I'm not interested in mediums per se. I'm not suggesting, because a lot of people, I did a big demonstration at the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference in 2017 with tarot cards, and people came up to me, and instead of saying, wow, let's talk about how that happened and how I felt engaged, they asked me, what deck of tarot cards do I use?
A new trick.
A new trick. You know, it's like, which one, CBT or IPT or EMDR? You're missing the point here. There's something that supports all of these processes that's culturally bound. That's not a bad thing. No. That's a good thing. If I know that, I can pull on those forces. I can use those forces in my work. So, but the interesting thing I think I found, and make sure that I'm answering your question, is that the minute we began talking or scratching this surface and talking about this, therapists would sometimes come up to me, lots, and say,
this is another dirty secret, isn't it?
Yes, it is a dirty secret. And they would say, well, you know, I didn't want to say this in public, but I've been seeing a psychic. You know, everybody in public says, oh, horoscopes, oh, stupid, oh, Barnum effect, oh, it's too general, they apply to everybody. The minute somebody says you can explain psychic performances to people by saying that they're so general they apply to everyone, I know instantly they've never seen a good psychic. I know it instantly. Because as you know, the story that I tell, the story that I tell in an article called How Psychotherapy Lost Its Magic was, I say to this guy, I don't believe in the paranormal. He takes out his tarot cards and he says stuff there is no way he could know. about me, detailed stuff.
So just stay with that moment for a second,
Yeah.
because that's kind of where it happens. Something, because you're not believing it, you have an experience and something happened. So without going into some private details, what happened? You had the experience that he knew something about you that he couldn't possibly know, because you have never met him before. He knew nothing about you.
He could have researched me. I'm a public person, but the things that he said are not public. They were so specific. And now let me just make a connection here to therapy, because as a clinician, multiple times over the course of my career, I've benefited from seeing a therapist. And I value deeply those experiences. The most profound moments in those experiences were almost always, number one, when I felt seen.
Yeah.
It's like, whoa, how did you know that? You get me. Yes, that's me. And then some direction. But the first thing was almost always the biggest healing element for me. Is like, I'm not crazy. You can see it too. And here's now what I might be able to do.
Yeah. That's a lovely thing. Maybe a lot of people go to therapy thinking they're crazy and go out of therapy and still think they're crazy.
I want to be seen. I want to show who I am as a person. And it was the same thing with the tarot cards, different methods, different tools, but the best ones, and I've now interviewed scores of tarot card readers and psychics, some of them able to put their finger on how they do it, others not, and had amazing encounters. But this very first one, as I say, was very jarring. He got my attention.
He got your attention. Yeah. So you put yourself in that position more times. I suspect that you have tried to experience what happens when you put yourself in relationship with.
As you know, and as you said, I spend my life and have spent much of my life on the road, traveling to different countries and places, teaching. And beginning in about 2007, maybe 8, whenever I would go, I would often look up and see was there a local card reader or psychic in the area. So I've done that in Australia. I've done that in Sweden, Denmark, and card readers are a lot like therapists.
Yeah. In what way?
Most are okay, and then there are some that are wow.
Yeah. And that's it's a pretty good point you made out in some talk. I heard that probably the psychic community, or I don't even know what to call that, but they get stigmatized by being some kind of woo-hoos, trippy people. But if we're self-critical, we can see that, well, doesn't that apply to therapists too? That there are some that really go their own strange way, and some stay in some kind of normative behavior, and we also have charlatans that are therapists. So that's a nice way of looking at it. I think that's a good point.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the biggest frauds in the United States against government-funded mental health care was committed by 2 psychologists.
Yeah.
So there is fraud everywhere, but this is what makes our work so so different. What separates therapists, in my opinion, from other helpers that could include a reader or your aunt or uncle is this ethical commitment.
Yeah.
I am committing not to exploit you and not to use you to my advantage. That's an ethical burden that I feel, and it's why part of my work is about knowing my limits. We've tried, I haven't helped. It's not your fault. What I know how to do just didn't help. Let's get you connected to someplace else. That's part of the ethical commitment I'm making to people. But you and I both know that in our field, we have therapies that go on for years and years. It's the exception, not the rule, but we do see that. And there are psychics who exploit people, of course, of course.
Yeah.
In my country, you can open up, for example, for psychologists, you can open up the Lead magazine, and every issue, there are people who've lost their license to practice because they violate boundaries. They have sex with their client.
Yeah.
They take advantage of them financially. So, cast the mote out of your own eye is sort of the idea here.
Yeah.
My point has never been to say everyone should go to psychics. That's not what I'm saying. Because for many people who are raised and steeped in a scientific, materialistic culture, that just doesn't make sense to them. Well, then you should probably talk to a therapist. That's what they're there for.
So this kind of leads us on this kind of conversions. This conversation is like a journey through this kind of field of different ways of putting ourselves in the context of the people we meet, and finding ways to really investigate what works. So from that point where you met that you had this experience with the tarot cards, and I know your whole team kind of went into investigating that, and you've been talking a little bit about that. So this eventually led to what you call, I think, if I'm not connecting the dots wrong, to deliberate practice.
It was sort of the other way around.
Okay.
So we initially knew there were these top performing therapists. We had no way to figure it out. And I literally stumbled on K. Anders Ericsson's work on expertise. And Anders Ericsson is a researcher. So his work, I will just say, it's hard for therapists to read because it's not directly, when our team called Anders Ericsson, at the time he was at I think the University of South Florida, don't hold me to that, in Tampa, he'd never been called by somebody from mental health. No. Chess players, business people, sports figures. He was a consultant to them all. Never had mental health, because we see ourselves as physicians of the mind. Deeply materialistic. He was really interested in, why do some performers in all of these fields do better than others? And he explained that process. And let me just give a brief statement. Most of us, our growth, remember we said therapist outcomes slow and then they decline? Well, he had an explanation for that. He said that's what almost everybody does in their particular skill domain. They grow in the beginning, and as soon as they master the basics, their growth levels off, and they eventually decline. In order to reverse that and get better and better, like the top performers did, you had to do this very difficult, painful process, deliberate practice. Measure your results, identify your problems, and practice those areas, work on those areas. And for therapists, by the way, just so you know, we've developed a tool, 2 tools. Tools to measure on my website.
Is it a method?
It is a operationalization of what Anders Ericsson said. Is it the end statement about it? Is it the final one, the best one? No, it's just a tool like a screwdriver.
I just adjust the mic a little bit more upwards, so we'll hear you better.
Yeah.
So
in that tool, you can get a tool to measure your outcomes, and then you can get a tool that will help you look through those outcomes and identify one thing to work on and tie it to something that we know influences outcome. So as we're doing this, and we're trying to figure out how to talk about what therapists do that leads them to have these superior outcomes. That's what led to the discussion with the mentalists. So these were sort of overlapping, etc. But the implications are big, because to me, if we're going to improve helping, we've got to look outside of this very medicalized, materialistic way of thinking about helping. because other cultures and peoples throughout time have been doing this.
So can I throw in a word? Because where does creativity fit in this? If you're talking about stepping outside the box of therapy thinking and the paradigm of medicalization, so there's some kind of creativity that I think you called something once, you had a name that you called the super sense, maybe the things that we can't see but seem to drive change in some different directions. I don't know if creativity belongs to that category, or it's a bit confusing, but it seems like, let me give an example that I heard you said. Milton Erickson has this guy showing up thinking he's Jesus. You remember that one? And he, I will bet you tell the story instead.
Well, it's a famous case that a person who had not responded to the care provided at the time, and I believe this was at a state hospital in Michigan, and instead of trying to confront this man's beliefs, Erickson simply said, "I understand you're a carpenter," and then put this man to work in the hospital building, I think it was bookshelves and doing other general carpentry activities.
So maybe it's the wrong word, but that kind of creativity or improvisation or that kind of reaction is a kind of a feedback, but it's quite instant. You can't measure it afterwards. You got to be there when it happens to respond.
So what the literature on deliberate practice indicates is that those who engage constantly pushing at the edge of their performance, and now I'm not talking about therapists thinking they're pushing their performance, because they all think that. The data just says they don't. So now we're talking about having measured, identified a deficit, and now you're working to improve in that very specific focal activity. That people who do that are able to create more novel integrations of different things that they know how to do in the moment, in the moment and context. So deliberate practice as an activity opens the door to creative applications.
So that's in a way, if you're talking about music or football or tennis, it seems effortless almost, the flow of how they manage whatever they are doing. And that's also, sometimes it looks like magic. It's so beautiful, it's so superhuman. You wonder if it's how it's possible, but it's kind of also forgetting that there's years or many years practice behind that kind of effortless.
But so now, again, you're speaking just like Erickson and our mentalist teacher that did the tarot cards with me. The whole point of an expert performance is to make it look effortless. Because none of the audience members are interested in all the work you put in. They're interested in the wonder, the feeling of awe that your performance creates. And that is part of it, because people on the outside, so for example, I was just watching this Russian figure skater at some current competition. She's 15 years old, and forgive me, I can't remember her name. You can find her all over YouTube. I love female figure skaters for a couple of reasons. First off, the athleticism is hidden. These aren't people that come out all buff with giant muscles and huge abs, and these are very graceful but super athletic people who do things that seem to defy the laws of gravity. This person was doing a quad. A quad.
A quad is like 4 spins or what?
4 full rotations before the tip of the skate touches down.
Wow.
It was just a few years ago that Tanya Harding, who became famous for another reason, stunned ice skating by completing a triple. Now they're doing quads. And if you watch her work, the grace of it is what should strike you. The effortlessness of it is what should strike you. But as you say, what you can't see is this huge tail pushing through the performance.
Yeah, well, that's I love that way of connecting outside of therapy and connecting back to therapy.
And now, how does therapy teach in contrast? Here's what you would get if there was a quad in psychotherapy. You would go to a workshop and I would show a video of somebody doing a quad, and I'd say, look at that, look at the leg position, look at the arms, and then I'd say, now do it. And the assumption would be that when you went home, you could do it because you'd seen it. It's exemplar teaching. Erickson would laugh at this because you cannot know what you need to do by watching examples.
No,
you just can't know it. You have to go through that process yourself.
I was thinking of an old colleague of yours, Inso Kimberg, who when you were working with solution focused therapy, which is a really interesting way of doing therapy. But I know you also found out that it's pretty much the same outcome, the difference than other therapies. But one thing that you couldn't copy was Inso Kimberg's way of doing solution focused therapy.
Yeah. And people tried. People even used her accent.
Yeah.
It's kind of crazy.
Yeah. So I look at the clock and I see it's ticking away. I knew it would go fast, but there's a.
Can I just mention one other thing?
Absolutely.
And that is that because you've highlighted in talking about Inso Berg that we need to shift our gaze. The primary message here is to shift our gauge away from the tool in our hands and back to us, away from anybody who says, if you use this method, you'll get better. And by the way, the field of mentalism and magic, for example, is just as fraught as our field. You go into any magic shop and they promise they will sell you a trick that will make you magical. And I promise you, they won't. You will be the same person with a dud magic trick in your hands. And it's the same with therapy.
Yeah.
You cannot get this. So just turn to yourself. I also want to just mention that we're talking about super performers here. And average performers of psychotherapy, when hearing this, they can get kind of discouraged and feel bad about themselves. But let me tell you, most therapists do darn good average work.
So that's my that's a question I really wanted to stay with, just because there's been a lot of mind-blowing stuff you've been talking about. So just to connect with your last thought, so say that I'm in the other side of this conversation, being somebody who suffers and wants help. I'm lying in my bed. Could you say something from that point of view to the person who's thinking, why bother with therapy? What's the point doing? I might as well stay in bed. So is there anything from this point of view? I know I'm shifting it quite a bit now, but I'm just interested in what would you say to someone who is in that frame of mind?
Focus on the results.
So how do I know if I drag myself out of bed and go see a therapist?
Yeah.
How do I know I'm seeing a good therapist?
How do you feel and what happens after you see them?
Okay.
And do you feel connected? Do you feel like they get you?
Yeah.
So I will tell you that I did not marry the first person I dated. And the first person I married, I'm not married to. And that's a good thing.
Yeah, that's a good thing.
So all therapists are not created equal, and all therapists are not equal. Even if they return good outcomes, they're going to have unique ways that maybe are a better fit with you. Some people love champagne. I don't like champagne. I would much rather, if given the choice, drink water. But I love a good Irish stout. So you have to find something, and that's hard.
Yeah.
Because our whole culture and the whole medical view, and particularly in a system perhaps like Sweden, where you're going to get who's assigned to you. But all therapists aren't created equal, and sometimes, and by the way, we're talking about therapists, but the same is true of physicians. Not all physicians are created equal either. So I think pay attention to what you're feeling. You should see some results.
Yeah, that's
sooner rather than later. Generally within 5 to 7 weeks, something should be happening for you. If it's not, you need to talk with your therapist about it. If they say it's your fault,
yeah,
I made a good motion picture that you don't like. It says something about your low tastes. If they say something like that, time to find a new helper.
Yeah. I feel like you're a mentalist while we're talking here, because you kind of answered my question before I had the chance to put it up. So thank you.
That.
That's good. That's really nice. It's been a wonderful time just diving into this topic and trying to figure out what works and what doesn't work, and how do we connect all the dots. And I could talk for hours with you, Scott, but I'm really grateful that you took the time. And I think both myself and the people who has listened will have your words echoing in our practice for a long time. I just want to mention also that I've been mentioning a couple of articles, so I'll be connecting the links to them so people can see, because they are free. So if you want to listen more to this kind of music, you can listen to them through those articles. And there's a lot of clips on YouTube and so. And there's also this, you want to say something about your web page and the kind of stuff, if someone is interested in connecting more to these kind of thoughts, what do you suggest?
I would say that going to the ICCE website, the International Center for Clinical Excellence website, and down in the lower right-hand corner, it'll say join the community. It doesn't cost anything. It will link you to a discussion forum where ideas like this are being discussed. And believe me, I fully recognize that when you first encounter them, if this is your first time, that it's a little bit like running into a brick wall, splat. And it can seem like the learning curve is perpendicular to the ground. It can, so don't go there. Be motivated instead by the last client you finished with in the session, but that you didn't finish with in your head. It was going like this around and around in your head. And you were thinking, oh, I could have said that. I wish I would have done. That's what this discussion forum is about. Supporting therapists being open and transparent about where their growth edge is. And there's a discussion forum right on the site. You can join in with us.
Great. So I'll put that link to the other links too. Wow, that was great. Nice jamming with you, Scott. So I'm thinking that we're closing this conversation now. Is there something you want to say before we close?
Nope. I appreciate the opportunity, Johnny.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Scott. We probably in some way probably read or bump into you when you're in Sweden sometime and see where this journey has moved from this conversation. But this was really nice. I'm so grateful.
Thank you. Och låt mig också säga, som ni ser på svenska, det var så litet.
Thank you so much. Bye bye. Bye bye.